A people have passed this way, a whole people. And they've left the poles of their burial scaffolds to mark the trail where they've passed. Their story and the trail itself goes back 20,000 years. The people live on after a fashion, but the trail ended less than 100 years ago. Here, on the great American plains, in the country of the Absaraka, near the river called the Greasy Grass. By the 1870s, the telephone, the mimeograph, the steam turbine had all been invented. We Americans were smack in the middle of the machine age, worshiping the wheel, we said. But at the same moment, they're dead in the sky. Not out of ignorance, but by deliberate choice. Some of us were still living literally in the Stone Age. Which Stone Age American, wrapped in his sleeping robe, journeyed from here to the beyond country, to the camp of many lodges? No one knows. No one knows his name, nor how, nor when he died. All that is known is that he lived on horseback, and his home was all around him, here on the Great Plains. He had never mapped the land, nor knew that the geographers who had scornfully labeled it the Great American Desert called it a permanent barrier to civilization, so sterile the devil couldn't raise hell on it, save in very small clinkers, hospitable only to serpent savages. But to the savage, his title was clear and indisputable. Whatever is cut by the feet of our pony, that is our land. Whatever is slashed by our lodge poles, that is our sky. And that was all the land that lay between the Mississippi and the Rockies, between the big river and the backbone of the world, and north from the Salt Fork of the Red River across the Medicine Line into Canada, the grandmother's land. What the map called a desert was actually one enormous rippling blanket of grass. This was the Great Plains. Here on land, every square inch of which promised to be theirs forever, lived more than half of the Indians in North America. Here lived the Absaroki, the people of the Raven, called the Crow, the Blackfeet and the Assiniboine, the Stone Boilers, the Cree of the Blackened Faces, and the Arikaras. Here lived the Crazy Knife people, the Kiowa, and the Osage of the Shaved Heads, and the Missouri of the Dugout Canoe. Here, too, were the people of the Puckered Moccasin, the Chippewa of the Plains, and the Wind River Shoshone, and the Comanche, called the Snake People, and the Pawnee, called the Wolf People. Here were the Sissitars, the Cut-Arm Cheyenne, and the Strong-Heart Arapaho, the people of the Blue Cloud. And around them all like a hoop, and darting through them all like an arrow, the Teton Dakota, the 7 tribes of the Sioux Nation. But the land was not theirs alone. It had been given them to share with the grasshopper and the black hawk and the great bull of the prairie. The earth belonged to all the things which lived on it, and the ghosts of all things which had lived on it. And there was an exaltation in them when they sang of their land. Here the 2-leggeds and the 4-leggeds lived together like relatives. All living things with feet and wings and roots are our children, and our thoughts rise high as the eagles do. The Indian prayed to the sky and the earth and the cardinal points. These were the 6 grandfathers, all natural forces, everything which existed. An accidental rock on the prairie, the wind's whisper. He was related to all things, and all things were related to the everywhere spirit. Above people listen, underwater people listen. Send a soft wind from the south, and let it warm the earth, and let it blow the coals of our cooking fires and warm our lodges, and let a good thing happen to our people. But the people, divided into 60 different tribes and separated by 7 different languages, had only one thing in common: a way of life. And one thing more, a pathetic belief that a brake of willows would hold back a wind which would blow from 4 directions at once. When the Indian first saw the 4-way wind, the whirlwind, He didn't know it because in the beginning it was just a wisp of smoke on the prairie. The red man had seen the white man before, of course, and had occasional friendly contact with traders and trappers. But he had seen so few of them, he was certain there were not very many. Now he was seeing more, and they were all in a hurry to reach the mountains. It was 1849, and each day on the prairie was one more day of poverty to California-bound gold seekers. The Dakota first called them Wasatchu, which meant godlike. Other tribes had other names, more descriptive. Hat-wearing people, men whose leggings meet in the middle, and hairy mouths. They told the Indian, "We want no more of your land than the width of our axles, and that for no longer than it takes to leave it behind." These would-be millionaires were an amusing curiosity to the Indian. The wagon people tell us about the yellow metal in the shining mountains and how it'll make them rich and big among their people. And then they begged the Indian for food. And another one said, when the sun is not in the sky, they cannot find the trail and they get lost. Then they become angry at the horses. But their horses are lost too. They make me laugh. And one said, the wagon people are very rude. Some of them smell bad. It annoyed the gold rushers that the Indian considered himself lord of his own domain. They are as arrogant as aldermen. It is grinding to be patronized in such lofty manner by these prairie aristos who dress their hair in dog fat and paint their pantaloons on in the morning. As the shining metal seemed to magnetize more and more wagons west, the Indians' curiosity and accommodation gave way to uneasiness. More and more they stopped the wagon trains to parley and asked the same questions they had asked the train preceding it. Why do you keep coming into our country, frightening away our game, setting fire to our grass? Each time you say that your wagon will be the last, and each time a wagon follows you. And each time they would be soothingly assured, there's no cause for alarm. We only want passage across your land, not the land itself. It was a promise the Indian was to hear many times from people who were just passing through. The Plains Indian had once just been passing through himself. Originally a forest dweller and farmer, he had straggled onto the prairie, pushed there from the east by other tribes and European colonizers. Here, he had discovered a strange and awesome beast, brought to the New World by Spanish conquistadores, the medicine dog, the horse, and he built a whole new culture around it. Wrote one observer, "Every savage is born with 6 legs, 2 of his own and 4 of his ponies. He mounts to dance with it, but he'd sooner do both on horseback." Unlike most nomads, they bred almost none of their stock themselves, replenishing it by trading and by raiding. Nor did they keep horses for meat and milk. Pony eating time was their name for famine. Their staple diet was buffalo meat, and an estimated 60 million bison making up the continental herd was an inexhaustible commissary on the hoof. It also provided the raw material for clothing and shelter and weapons. In fact, most everything the Indian needed had to be mined from the shaggy carcass of the buffalo. Like the Indians, they were immigrants of the Great Plains. They went where the grass was and followed the seasons around the zodiac. Said a Crow chief, "This is how we live." When the summer heat scorches the prairie in the moon of cherry ripening, we can draw up under the mountains where the air is sweet and cool, the grass fresh, and the bright streams come tumbling out of the snowbanks. There we can hunt the antelope and the deer when their skins are fit for dressing. There we will find plenty of white bears and mountain sheep. In the autumn, when the yellow leaves come, when our horses are fit and strong from the mountain pastures, we can go down to the plains and hunt the buffalo and the elk, or trap beaver on the streams. And when the cold moon comes, the moon of the frost and the teepee, and the tree-popping moon, we can take shelter in the woody bottoms along the rivers. And there we will find saltweed and cottonwood bark for our ponies, and buffalo meat for ourselves. The Indian, then, was a nomad. A more advanced civilization called him by another name, vagrant. It was the moon of the birth of the calves and the spring thaws that melted the snow. But the people still saw something white on the prairie. More wagons, more pudding-footed oxen, more white-faced people. A Sioux prophet had said, the Wasatchew are like bees. First one, then the swarm. Pressured out of the east by overpopulation, political unrest, bad debts, bad crops, these were family men now, bringing their families with them. The Indian called their women squaw white men, and generally he was not impressed. One of them said, her face like toothache. Maybe so she bite on green quince. Nor were the emigrants impressed. Expecting Longfellow's Hiawatha, the noble savage, we met instead with starveling beggars. They exact generous gifts in return for our passage, and are indifferent that we carry little that can be spared in our getting there. The Indian had none of the European devotion to the concept of property, but he put an almost holy value on the virtue of generosity. Convinced that the white man's stinginess was based on ignorance, he sought to educate him by stealing what he felt should have been gracefully given. Noted one pioneer, what he wouldn't steal, a hound pup wouldn't pull out of a tan yard. White hot stoves are generally accounted to be safe in their presence. Red hot stoves, however, are not. Resentful of paying tribute and wary of revenge if they didn't, emigrant trains took to corralling in defensive circles. They bolted nervous meals and quieted their fretful children with a new bogeyman. If you don't behave, the Indians will get you. And in the teepee, there was also a new culture frightener. If you don't behave, the Wasatchew will get you. The Indians' love for their children was extravagant. Noted one pioneer, they are hopelessly spoiled. Until the age of 2, they are laced in a cradle board, never out of their mother's sight. She corrects petulance or other naughty behavior by ignoring it. No Indian cub is ever beaten, and they account us as barbaric because we occasionally strike our young. These redskins are raised by example, not precept, for they have no concept of abstract right and wrong. Their children are insatiable in their appetite for admiration and praise. And what passes for character and virtue amongst them stems entirely from this. Childhood was pleasant but short, for they are expected to become adults as quickly as possible. Betrothals were theoretically family arranged, but like everywhere else, the young people often had their own ideas. Sky-treading bird of the prairie, wonderful fawn-eyed one, when you are beside me, my heart sings. A branch it is, dancing, dancing before the wind spirit, in the moon of strawberries. Considering the harsh realities of nomadic life, Indian courtship was surprisingly romantic. A trip to the stream for water could provide countless accidental brief encounters. And for the more bashful suitors, there were more discreet trysts. Nighttime visits to check the pony herd, and whisperings muffled through the dew cloth of a teepee. Earth smiles, the waters smile, and even the sky of clouds smiles. But I I lose the way of smiling when you are not near. Marriage was solemnized by bestowal of gifts on the bride's family. And while polygamy was allowed, the extra cost was usually prohibitive. A man rich enough to take a second wife was generally smart enough to marry his wife's sister. This minimized both the family friction and the number of in-laws. One pioneer woman could admire a Cheyenne housewife. She is vain of her domestic duties and would bitterly resent any recommendation that he who protects the home should help erect it. Hers is a life which would debilitate an Egyptian pyramid builder. What is the men do? What is merely exhausting the women? Divorce is uncommon, and a runaway wife is held in disgrace by her own family. Infidelity is rare. The penalty, facial mutilation. Today we saw a cut-nosed squaw, a wretched creature, and a warning that even here, so far from a Christian altar, there are brambles in the primrose path. The Indian wondered now what the Wohas were bringing in the wagons, and why the people who were just passing through were planting seeds around his lodges. Had not long ago grandfather Thomas Jefferson said, "It may be regarded as certain that not a foot of land will ever be taken from the Indians without their consent"? But now another grandfather had touched the pen to something called the Homestead Act, which gave grab deed and sit-down title to 160 acres of prairie to anyone who wanted it. To cropped-out eastern farmers, a land velvet with buffalo grass cried for the deep gash of the plow. They turned the prairie wrong side up, said the Indian, and he couldn't understand why his land had become something called public domain, and why the white man's spotted buffalo was called private property and couldn't be hunted. He was puzzled to learn that the rights of prior possession seemed to date only from the arrival of the newcomers, and that somehow his land was to pass to their sons. And there were so many of them, for they multiplied at twice the rate he did. And their cubs would grow to look on his land as real estate, and his people as trespassers on it. And he tried to file his own title. The soil you see is not ordinary soil. It is the dust of the flesh and the bones of our ancestors. You will have to dig deep to find nature's earth, as the upper portion is crow. And a Sioux warrior said, "The earth is our mother. One does not pound steaks in his mother." The Plains culture was based on warfare. An Indian's wealth was reckoned in horses, and his prestige in the number he could afford to give away. Both depended on raiding the herds of his neighbors. Warfare, not on the grand scale of the white man, but raid and counter-raid, was a way of life. From infancy, every boy was raised to combat as a profession, a sport, and a part of his religion. And it demanded exhaustive training in physical endurance and the skills of weaponry. Enrollment in a war party was always voluntary and eagerly sought after. In some tribes, no boy was accepted as a recruit until, armed only with a bow, he had attacked a hornet's nest, could keep at least 3 arrows in flight at once, and could hit a grasshopper on the bound. Dreaded only old age, and if he could do it gloriously, would deliberately seek death in battle. Glory, individual glory, was the dominant motive in Indian warfare. The right to wear the eagle feather, or to paint a boastful record of one's exploits on his lodge cover, could only be earned by conspicuous acts of bravery. To kill an enemy was not especially praiseworthy. That could be done without honor, from ambush. Many Indian battles were virtually bloodless. Each warrior would try to seek out an armed opponent for single combat. The object was to strike a blow of varying degrees of honor, with a bare hand, an empty gun, a feather-tipped spear, or the flat of a bow. Wounds and death were common enough, but always incidental to glory. Scalps were coveted, not as honors, but as trophies. The Great Plains was a perpetual arena of intertribal civil war. The Indians were so concerned with fighting each other that there were things they saw too late. Shoveling down the crowns between wheel ruts had turned westbound wagon trails into roads, and roads ran east and west. Lightning stages and jerk-line freights were clattering on point-to-point schedules and bringing to the wilderness that basic credo of civilization, the timetable. Temporary passage had become right of way, and the Indian was warned to stay wide of the roads because your feathers frighten our horses. And he saw his rivers, too, being drowned by wheels. Where the fireboats roiled the Missouri and the Snake and the Yellowstone, the buffalo refused to come and drink. And low water didn't stop them either, for they could navigate, it was said, tears of a weeping woman. The Wasatch turned the streams into turnpikes and timbered out the banks for fuel, and said he had something called riverine and riparian rights. The Indian was being squeezed. And then he was run over by the black metal snake. The fireboat that walks on the mountain cut his land into strips, crisscrossed it with feeder lines, and set it afire with embers from his patented spark arresters. And they axed out what was left of his woodlands for ties and trestles. Running alongside like a picket fence were telegraph poles. And the Indian hated the whispering wires because they marked the course of the railroad. The Indian watched the wagons that are tied together, bringing in not only more settlers, but the blue-dressed soldiers. Wrote one sympathetic dog-face, "I'd feel the same way John Indian does if a pack of Chippeways had scooched down on Boston Common and then told me to keep the grass." The Army was there to prevent trouble, look for it, but it was on the way. Herds of beef cattle, worth only $3 a head, were pushed north from breeding grounds of Texas, up the Chisholm Trail, and the Western, and the Goodnight and Bozeman trails. At the end of the long drive, they fattened up and tallied out at $40 a head. But the cattle trail had cut across the game trail. The Indian, hunting the shaggy buffalo, found that the best grass and water had been staked out for the spotted buffalo. It takes 8,000 acres of prairie to support a single Indian by the chase, said the herdsman. Using the same lands, we can put meat on the table of half the world. When I was a boy, the Sioux owned the world. Where are our lands? Who owns them now? The Indian is a scavenger with no more title to the land than a jackass rabbit. Wherever I go, there is sharp wire to tear my pony's flanks. If I cannot hunt, my people will sicken. My children will starve. Hungry, why, they ought to have the hot soup of justice everlastingly pumped into them. They are fat thieves. If my white brother says I am fat, it is because I have been stuffed with lies. You don't courthouse a varmint, you have to kill it. In the dialogue between the possessor and the dispossessed, there was no communication, only exchange. The original game of cowboys and Indians was going to be played for keeps, as the rancher, like other settlers, built his outbuildings an extra log thicker and pierced them with loopholes. I cannot eat the grasshoppers or the white men, so I eat what they have left. The Indian had little choice, for his own commissary had been deliberately destroyed. The Gandy dancers and track layers who built the railroad were fed on buffalo meat. Tens of thousands were slaughtered and butchered on the prairie. The completed railroad sent out refrigerator cars to fetch only the choice cuts for the eastern market. The rest of the meat was left to rot where it fell. But it was the curved knives of the skinners which did the most damage. Stinking, flea-bitten gold mines, they called the buffalo. A bronze medal should be presented to every hunter, with a dead buffalo on one side and a discouraged Indian on the other, they said. These men had the solution to the Indian problem. Almost overnight, they would reduce a herd of 60 million buffalo to a few hundred stragglers. Then they gleaned the bones and shipped them east to be ground into fertilizer and carved into knife handles. One paper reported, bone shipments would make a string of freight cars 15,000 miles long. And when the buffalo bones played out, they exhumed dead Indians and sent their bones east to be made into button hooks. What they hoped would be a discouraged Indian became an enraged Indian. War was never officially declared, but at Spirit Lake, 30 settlers were killed. At the Washita, 100 Cheyenne. At Sand Creek, 300 more. At Acton, New Ulm, Birch Coulee, and Fort Ridgely, 1,500 settlers massacred. And there was Rush Creek, Springs, Dead Buffalo Lake, Killdeer Mountain, Little Missouri. The names have been forgotten, most of them. Perhaps that's the greatest tragedy, that anonymous people died in unremembered places from causes they never completely understood.